Good evening. My name is Johanna Koljonen and you are watching Crosstalks, a collaboration between two of Sweden's leading universities, Stockholm University and KTH, the Royal Institute of Technology. You're welcome to join us in discussion of today's topics on Twitter, where our handle is Crosstalks TV and our hashtag is Crosstalks. The world is moving from agrarian to urban at a faster pace than ever before. By 2050, 2 out of every 3 people will be living in urban areas. Sprawling cities with rapidly growing populations are creating difficult challenges when it comes to traffic, housing, social infrastructure, and environmental footprint. How can we meet the opportunities and challenges of the modern city and build towards safe, sustainable, and socially diverse environments? Here to discuss this interesting challenge are Professor Mattias Höjer, Director for the Center for Sustainable Communications at KTH, Gunnel Forsberg, Professor at Stockholm University and Director of the Stockholm Urban and Regional Research Environment, and Alexander Ståhle, Researcher at KTH School of Architecture and CEO of Spacescape. Welcome to Crosstalks.
Thank you.
I'm actually going to start with a very basic question to lay a foundation for this discussion. It may sound silly, but I think this is a good place to begin. Why do people want to live in cities? What is the primary function of cities to people? Does anybody have an answer?
I'm sorry.
All right, let's start over here, Alexander.
I just think that you can answer it one simple word. It's proximity. It's the basic meaning of cities is to create exchange between people. So that's the very short answer actually, and that means a lot of things as we know.
Proximity, Gunnel.
Well, I would say it in another way because I think that the answer is it's multifunctional. And the first function is that it's a place where the work possibilities are. So that's why people want to live in cities because there's opportunities for gainful employment. And of course, it's also where the higher education is. Mm. So if you want to have a higher education, you need to live in a city of some kind of structure. And it also, of course, is the idea about social and cultural opportunities. That's kind of attractive people. Mm-hmm. But I also think that it has something to do with the discourse. It's an urban discourse saying that people need to live in cities, and I'm not sure that it necessarily have to be that way.
Mattias?
Well, you said, I think, the most important reasons already, but I think it could also be important to contrast. Not everybody wants to live in cities. Mm-hmm. Some people don't. I had this wonderful experience with a bunch of football youngsters on a flight when I was approaching Amsterdam, and they looked out and they said, "Oh, this is such a huge city." And then they contemplated for a while, and then they said, "There can't be anything to do there." They came from a very small town in the north of Sweden. I think they just saw the distance to the forest where there were things to do. So I guess you can look at it in different ways.
Yeah, I think I'm just realizing as you're describing this in these different ways that a lot of that comes down to life choices. Yeah. They're different in rural and urban areas, but of course there's a wider range of choices. You can choose different paths for yourself. You're not as locked into what your parents were doing in an urban environment than you would have, at least historically, been in a rural environment. And that already is wonderful because it brings the human into this conversation at the very beginning. Mattias, when we first talked to you about this a while back, you observed that the future is not something that just happens, but something that we create. Could you develop this thought in the context of cities?
I think it's extremely important to remember that because we are fed with forecasts all the time, and we need the forecasts in order to be able to plan. But it's also quite provocative when we think that the forecasts are truth. And of course, you can make a very tough statement and say, or a rough statement and say, if we don't build any more houses, or if we even tear them down, the ones we have, I'm sure that Stockholm will not grow. So it's not that the forecasts are doomed to be the way they are, but they are also very much self-fulfilling. So in that way, we are creating our future, and we are partly creating it with our forecasts. So that's the main point of that.
You work with future studies, and you told us that transportation is one of the most important factors to discuss in this context in the future of cities. Why is that, and what are the most important challenges we see?
I think transport and also the size of apartments or the size of housing will also be crucial, both for city life, because if we live slightly smaller, then we get more life in the city, we get more services, we get more proximity. We live twice as big in Stockholm now as we did 50 years ago per person, which means that the city gets less people and you get further distances to everything or to services. But transport, of course, is what keeps the city together. It's not just the transport system, but also how much we actually need to travel. And a lot of travel we might want, but the typical long distance commuting every day is not something that everybody likes. A lot of people like a bit of travel every day, but not those very long. So I think that is a key for what kind of cities we will get, how much we travel.
Gunnel, when thinking about cities and city planning, people often focus a lot on buildings, roads, these kinds of hardware. But a city is, of course, just as much about the people and the interactions of different groups of people in the city environment. In many of today's big cities, we see many different kinds of segregation. How does this affect a city?
I think first I would like to say that segregation, that is maybe one of the most difficult challenge to deal with when we talk about urban planning, because it's such a big problem, and we have found out that most cities today have really big segregation issues to deal with, and it's both that we have these quite big suburban areas with people living there feeling that they have been abandoned by the society in a way. So they get quite angry and quite frustrated. But we also have these segregated areas with better off people who also live in enclaves, because we live only in these enclaves where we meet people that are like us. And of course that's a problem, that we don't meet people with other kinds of lives and other kinds of opportunities. And that goes for both of these kind of segregated areas. And we know for a lot of research that this segregation is class related. It's mostly related to class. But as class also very ethnic related. So the segregation is also ethnic.
I should probably translate for the benefit of our very international audience that of course these mechanisms are the same everywhere, but the shape it takes is different. So in Sweden, for instance, inner city areas are attractive areas to live. So suburbia becomes a lower class environment. Of course, we know in American cities, for instance, it's often the reverse. But the mechanisms are the same. The wealthy isolate themselves in this manner.
Because we have all of our city areas are gentrified, so we have really we don't have these very cheap buildings in the cities that we have in other parts of the world. We've been very ambitious when it comes to planning and reshaping the inner city.
You said shaping now, and I wonder what can we do about affecting these factors that drive segregation?
Yeah. In a way, we have to build more multifunctional. We have to build the urban in a way that we don't segregate for various parts of the city. We have to build in a way that people from different classes and different ethnic groups would like to live together. And that's easy to say, but of course it's not much more difficult to do. But we need to have a planning ideology that have the ambition to do that.
So on a very basic level, it can mean mixing different price levels of housing in the same geographical areas.
Yes. Some people would like to own their houses or their homes, but some don't, and that should be it should be possible to live in any kinds of areas, but regardless of that.
Yeah.
Don't you think that it's also very much related to how big the differences are between rich and poor in a society? If there are very big differences, is it possible to build that change? Because the rich will always, I guess, try to create their enclaves and pay for it.
Of course. It's not an easy question, but that's what the market does.
Yeah, so
the idea with the planning is to try to challenge that.
And also there's this question again about proximity, distance and transformation. I think proximity drives tolerance somehow. Maybe we don't have to live on the same block, but if we're literally a block away, then this whole other group, this whole other life, then maybe those barriers can be broken down. So it's very complicated. Let's bring in Alexander. You do research on city planning. You're also the CEO of a company that develops analytics tools for city planning. What would you say, with these double perspectives, is the most important trend in the evolution of big cities today?
Yeah, I will go back to my first answer, that what basically drives city development is the search for proximity. And if, for example, if you look at what drives housing markets and office markets in European and American cities as well, you could see in studies that have been made recently that the most important factor is actually walkability. And in another way of seeing it, car independency. So where you have the higher prices of apartments, for example, is where you don't need to have a car to do your daily life. And also, if you look at where offices rent, or the rents of offices are higher, it's mostly in public transport nodes. Because there you have a multimodal, you have a freedom of transportation modes. So you can choose to take your car or walk or bike or public transport to work. So I think that is what we can see is a big change from, say, 20, 30, 40 years ago, when the car society was really dominating development. And this means that urban development is going downtown, so to speak. We are seeing prices going up not only in Stockholm, but in Oslo, Copenhagen, London, San Francisco, New York, in centrally located areas. And this, of course, puts a difficult challenge to gentrification and segregation issues. And
so now I'm already learning things in this conversation, so now we have to do some checking here. So the shift away from a car-based urban environment, is this a projection or is it something that's already happening?
Yeah, what we can see is that people are already paying for car independency. So it's already here. But we have a city that, you know, the architects and engineers and the politicians 100 years ago, like in the 1920s, had this idea of a car city in full bloom and working and solving everything. And what we can see today is that it's not so nice.
No.
We have built a city which is not creating that kind of proximity, closeness, density, integration that we are looking for when we're going to cities. So the car city is creating distance.
But does this development mean that, for instance, I mean, I guess logically that would mean that we would have more centers, more functioning centers where people can work and shop and go to school and do all of those things, that having just one geographical downtown area is probably not enough for a big city. And this is one of those ideals that I feel like I've been reading about it in the newspaper for decades, but are we actually getting more of those functioning city centers in urban areas?
The thing is with cities is that they are sustainable. They are in a way big physical artifacts that change very slowly. So we are seeing a densification of cities and nodes along transport, public transport, and so on. But I think what is uncertain for the future is what will happen to transportation technologies, which are changing much faster with the digital things, and you can connect different modes of transport, etc.
Gunnel.
I think also that we can see that the driving license is decreasing. Young people don't take driving license anymore because it's not possible. They can't afford to have a car. They don't know where to put it, and they don't even need it. So that's a big change, I think.
I'd like to come back to the question you said there. If the situation that Alexander is painting, if that is the way we are heading, and then you asked, we created this, isn't that? Yeah. The point is that we are actually creating the future. So this is exactly the description Alexander gives. Is a description until today, or maybe yesterday. I don't know how fast you have updated that. But then when it comes to where we're heading, that depends on what we create. And that depends a lot of course, technological developments, but also a lot on which policies we choose, which politicians we choose. And that is extremely important, because if we think like I think it's good with this car city utopia. They were very successful in creating that. That was a vision, and they built it. And that's, in a way, then, giving some hope, because if we could create that, we can also create other visions.
Then I have to ask, let's just very briefly paint the vision. What is a city without cars like? How is it different how is the experience of it different from what we're experiencing today?
Yeah, I think that change we will see a lot of changes in the transportation system. What happens when basically all cars are self-driving? When you have drones delivering stuffs to your home.
This is the kind of things I mean. Sorry, the drones. We'll have drones in the air. Will we have fewer cars?
There's been a calculation at KTH just simulating what will happen if all cars are self-driving, and that would theoretically mean that you can take away about 90% of the cars in a city. So then, theoretically, you would not need any car parking. That would free up a lot of space. You would not need to build parking garages in housing, so that will get housing much cheaper. So many of these technologies could totally change our future urban environment.
And they would be so much more quiet as well, which is a big thing, I think.
And safer.
Yes, of course. Joining us now from London via Skype is Andrew Carr, Senior Project Architect at the award-winning Brady Mallalieu Architects in London. He has, among other things, worked as project architect on the award-winning Phoenix Heights residential development at Canary Wharf in London. Welcome to Crosstalks.
Hi, good evening.
Andrew, what trends do you see in urban design and city planning right now?
Well, in London, one of the big topics at the moment is housing and the provision of housing. A lot of the themes you've already touched on are very pertinent here. There's a large influx of people, an increasing population in London, very high rental and sale prices for housing. And that's causing segregation problems. It's causing problems of diversity in the city. People are having to move further and further out in order to be able to afford to live, which places more pressure on the transport system. So a lot of the topics you've already begun to touch on are really quite relevant, I think, to London at the moment.
Are there any strategies for countering this, where you feel that perhaps London is ahead of the curve?
I'm not sure. I think everyone's looking around for answers at the moment. Certainly there are lots of legislative kind of things, which are initiatives which are being put in place to try and help things. But really it probably needs a cooling property market and seeing buildings and homes not just as financial investments, but as places for people to live in, to switch really our focus onto providing homes and communities for people rather than just places to invest money and reap rewards from it.
But given that the housing situation is dire in London, as it is in Stockholm, in fact, how likely is it that the housing market will cool?
I don't know. I suspect not. So we're probably stuck with that. Certainly, there are lots of other things out there which are just accepting that situation and looking for ways of trying to address it. We're working with a developer called Pocket, who develops very small housing, so you can make more efficient use of land, but make sure it's very well designed so that whilst you have smaller space, you can make use of it very effectively. There are lots of other things out there. The New London Architecture Centre has made a lot of competitions recently which are looking at new ideas in housing. They're looking typically at new forms of making it to do the self-build, making use of rooftop spaces, plots of land which are disused and might be made better use of, or also making use of the canal system, putting homes floating on rivers, canals, waterways, whatever that might be. So there are some more innovative ideas beginning to emerge from that, but it's still very early days, I think.
That's exciting. Let's see if our panelists are recognizing anything here. Gunnel is nodding. Are there similar trends here?
No, do we really see that? I'm not sure that this exactly is what we are seeing.
Maybe we have very strong regulation in Sweden, so
yes.
for the kinds of buildings
I think we have
which is limiting
we need to take that into account, because when looking at various cities in the world, we come up with the different regulations and different policies. Make some change.
But I think Andrew was touching on something incredibly important here, which is the role of the market, which seems to be the enemy of sane planning in some way. And then, of course, I think a Nordic reflex is to say, well, certainly we can put in even more regulation to solve this problem and control very clearly what kind of building should happen. And there seems to be a tendency, at least, that the more we micromanage this through regulation, the less creative solutions are open for. Certainly, that's what the developers are saying in highly regulated markets. So how do we weigh the balance between them, Mattias?
I'm not going to respond to that question, though, but okay,
I have another one.
Can I take another one?
Do.
Because I think it was interesting that Andrew brought up this with the smaller size of new builds. I think that other things that remind of that solution should also and must also come up. That will be refurbishments of the already existing buildings towards smaller units, so that it gets easier to live more people in smaller spaces. But also through different ways, also sharing the current apartments or the current houses that we have. And there are, of course, discussions on how that can be done and how that can be supported from legislation. And we are also there going towards making that slightly easier with new apps that coming up, that we get. It gets easier to let out a spare room, for instance, for a night or two. But with this development, we at the same time get opportunities for even further increasing prices, so that if we just get that opportunity, it might have the other effect, that is having a lot of empty apartments standing, only being let out night by night. But still, there is an opportunity to a much higher use of spaces, use of apartments through that kind of solutions.
Alexander?
Well, I don't know if I agree completely, because what seems to be in demand here from the market is, as said, proximity and density. And what the urban economists say is that the market will never cool if we don't deliver this. So we have to raise the supply to cool the demand. But then I think there are some misconceptions of actually how dense the city already is. Actually, if we look at the standard inner city environment that we have today in central Stockholm, it's about 20 times as dense as low density sprawl, which is just outside the inner city. So I would say that we have a lot of land, centrally located land that we could develop, but that land is have restrictions on development and in plans, so you cannot raise density and development on that land because it's by law restricted in terms of building heights and so on.
Because these are green areas.
Yeah, so
they do serve a function, you know. It is understood.
No, not green areas. I'm talking about villa areas.
Oh yeah,
So a standard villa plot. Detached house plot is only 5% as dense as an ordinary city block, and that means that there is a huge potential in densification of already built up areas, and so I don't really agree that we have to be cramped into small apartments to fit into the city. There's a lot of land. We did at Spacescape. We did the analysis of the availability of development land in Stockholm, just in the city of Stockholm. You could see that you can easily fit 140,000 dwellings within the limits of the city of Stockholm without building any skyscrapers. You can just, the highest building could be like 4 or 5 stories high. So there's a lot of land, I would say.
I think that would be very good for diminish the segregation, because in that case there would be more people living in these areas without necessarily want to have their own house.
Yes.
So that could be a very good way to
increasing housing choice.
Yes.
Also, sometimes they call them divorce apartments.
Okay.
Divorce apartments.
Yeah.
But this, I was thinking earlier when Mattias said that we are living in bigger apartments than before per person. I think certainly in the Nordic countries, a big answer to or a big reason why is that so many of us are living alone. I mean, or are the apartment actually bigger, or is it a social change that has driven this? On average, because how do we then solve it if it's not actually an architecture problem, it's more a cultural issue?
Yeah, or a wealth issue. We are so much rich now, and space is one of the things people tend to buy when they get rich.
Also, perhaps they tend not to marry as fast if they can survive as a single-income household.
That could be also, but I also think that with 2 kids, you might have 3 extra bedrooms or something if you can afford it, and more people can afford bigger apartments. So, and yeah.
But then again, I think that what I learned from today's Stockholm, people are living in smaller and smaller apartments again. Due to the fact that it's very expensive, and so people want to stay in the city, and then they have to share room. The children need to share rooms, which they did before.
An aspect of this is also, I think, that the idea of the suburb is something was like 100 years old idea, which is based on maybe idea of a core family with only one person working. So when you have a family where there are 2 persons working, and you have 2 workplaces to go to, and then you have had to let off your children, I would say this new spatial logic are pushing people into central locations, because it takes too much of commuter time if you are 2 persons living in one end of the city.
And also, of course, the fact that 100 years ago inner cities were terrible places of poverty and dangerous and sicknesses and very dirty. I mean, if you've read your Dickens, certainly that was also true in London. But I think everything we're saying now, this combination of architecture, planning, the social dynamics within the family, this is very, very interesting. And it feels like it touches on something that we don't often talk about, which is the role of architecture in shaping social norms and social reality, and certainly that's also true for city planning. Let's start with Andrew. Andrew, how would you say, how can we use architecture and city planning to promote specific norm systems like social equality, or to encourage innovation and social interaction?
Yeah, well, one thing which any housing developed in London has to do is provide a certain amount of social or affordable housing as part of the mix of the overall number of units. And I mean, that varies depending on what the kind of political situation and the local authority who are looking after that particular plot of land. But typically it might be 25 to 50% of the number of units which are created on that site. So you can end up with developments, even within one plot, where you have a mixture of different tenures, whether they be rented, social, private. It's a matter then of how that's organised. You can easily end up with all of the private for sale units at one end of the site and all of the social rented units at the other. So there's kind of segregation there. One thing that we're very interested in as architects is the way we might design communal in-between spaces to allow interaction between the residents and users of that building and its locality. At the Massmaker Road project called Phoenix Heights, we designed a community strip there, which combines a community centre with community allotments, with a rooftop football pitch, with gardens and shared spaces, which just within one development will hopefully allow those within the building to interact. And we tried to make sure as far as we could mix tenures in different parts of the building. So we weren't segregating different either tenure groups, whether they rented or sales, but also different sizes of units. So it's not that families are in one part of the development and childless couples are in another part. Actually, there's a whole mixture of people going on in that place and spaces for those people to interact and connect with one another.
There is a narrative, I think, often when these kinds of projects are described, or the sort of utopia of the mixed-use block is described, where people say, well, obviously that would generate a lot of conflicts. I don't know, is that obvious? In your experience, does it generate conflicts, or does it in fact generate happiness and a feeling of safety?
I think it can generate both. I think what it's also about is giving the opportunity for the people that live there to kind of take it on in their own terms. And no, I'm not here as an architect trying to determine exactly how people interact and use that building. I'm setting up a kind of framework which they can then inhabit and use. So, hopefully, I guess as an optimist, I'd hope that they would be happy in that kind of environment. But ultimately, I've got to leave the building for people to occupy rather than try and control how they might use that. But I can try and put conditions in place so that there are sort of positive relationships and positive spaces where these things can happen.
Mattias was laughing at, hopefully. What were you thinking?
No, of course, it's that was just... I'm glad we all
you
hope they
recognize
will be
this
happy.
feeling, yes.
No, it was just that. I had another point, though, but that was not directly related to this. Okay, I can wait if you want to comment.
Let's say, Gunnel, how would we build a city if the primary goal was to promote equality, for instance, and as we're saying?
Well, I think that's $1 million question. I think because it's very difficult to see. But I think that we've been talked about is that the idea or the tendency for planning to have a dichotomic way of planning, meaning that you build one sector in that place and another for other issues or for other topics in another way. And that means that we have we have public in one place and private in another place. We have production areas in one place and then reproduction in another way. And that means that it's very complicated to get things together. So I think one issue, one important way for planning is to try to get these together again in a way of suing kind of planning.
But then is there in this specific area field or on this specific progress, is there here also a conflict between planning and the wishes of the market?
I'm sure it is. Because the market has other goals, of course, than planning. It must be. And
Alexander?
I think it's a more complex relationship between planning and market because they are dependent on each other. Look at Manhattan Grid. It was a general street grid put out, which has been creating a lot of plots for developers to develop. And I think we had a big research project at the School of Architecture looking at how do the spatial design of cities create integration between neighborhoods. and I really want to live because it's not sure that we can, in what scale shall we mix things, the mixed city, in what scale, in what geographic scale should this mix be? Should it be in the same building or the same block or same neighborhood? And I think the key to this, what we found in that research project, is that the network of public spaces are actually the mixer. That's the street of a city is where people interact and can integrate. So maybe we cannot mix everything so that every neighborhood has a lot of everything, but at least we could connect city districts with a truly public grid where everyone can move freely. So, for example, if you live in one neighborhood, you share a street with other people in another neighborhood. So the street becomes a shared space where you meet people from different districts. So I think that's a basic condition for social integration.
It's interesting that you're describing basically on a larger scale almost exactly what Andrew talked about designing on the sort of building complex level. So there seems to be some kind of fundamental truth here. It's very, very interesting. Mattias?
I would like to change the subject slightly, or the angle a little bit, because now we had this the integration and the work in the city and at district level. But I think that one thing that is going to change cities a lot is the pressure that will come from environmental demands and the energy prices. They will change, we'll need to do something about it. And I think that's the reason why I'm looking more into smaller apartments than into new builds when this is possible. Because if we build new builds, if we continue living as big as we can, as we do, then we will not be able to reduce energy use. And this will be crucial. And this will also put a lot of pressure on transport systems. It will put a lot of pressure on how we live and how we can live in cities. So all those things will interact, but it will be planning, the market, and the environment coming in as a third force here that we often tend to neglect.
So most big cities do have sustainability plans or goals, at least.
But they don't know what they mean.
Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
It's actually very complicated to say. Many cities try to have some kind of objectives on greenhouse gases, for instance. How much should the city emit? But the question of how much greenhouse gases or energy a city uses is really complex. And we actually made a study on this a couple of years ago with 10 European cities, and it turned out that none of them actually knew what their targets meant when you asked in detail. And when you look into them, for instance, should you or should you not include flights for the citizens? Is that something that the city should bother about, or is it nothing at all? It depends on if you look at the city as a city or if you look at the city as citizens. And the consumption in the city, should that be included as an energy use or a greenhouse gas emission of the products that you consume in the city or not?
Well, this is terrifying to hear, of course.
It is terrifying, actually.
And clearly some standards need to be developed. Is there today a correct way of measuring these things, or are we figuring it out as we go along?
I would say there is not a standard that is that is widely used. There are a couple of ways of doing it, but the even more scary thing is that often the cities don't even know themselves what they include and what they don't, or at least not the politicians setting the targets. That comes almost up as something they try to calculate afterwards. Oh, what did we include in this? And it is not that they are stupid, it's that it is quite difficult.
Gunnel, did you want to come in? No, sorry, it looked like you were about to comment. But then I just started to follow up on this. What are the most important factors in a sort of transformation towards sustainability? Because this is actually a very urgent issue. Cities change slowly, but this is a problem we're going to have to attack very aggressively, very, very fast, if we're going to have cities at all.
Generally, I would say that the most and the thing that everybody wants, it's of course technological development, and I think that will be the most important thing. But I don't think that it will be enough. And therefore, after that comes the difficult parts. And there comes things as size of the apartment, and of course how much we travel and by which means. And there again, there are sometimes we try to build even bigger and bigger cities, trying to have, or regions, city regions having 100 kilometers commuting each day. And that is also a very big problem, even if you go by train. Because if you get up to that distance, it's like 100 kilometers in each direction, then you're actually using as much energy as you use by an ordinary car commute in a city today. So it's we have to look at both the distances, the amount of trips, and of course the energy used for actually for the buildings. And then it's not only the housing, it's also of course offices and shops and so on. I think a bit of a pressure on heated spaces is very important.
I'm becoming a little bit overwhelmed by this. It's starting to feel like an unsolvable problem. Is this an unsolvable problem? Gunnel,
I wouldn't.
Gunnel first.
It must, of course, it must be a solution, and maybe it has to do something with how you or how we organize our work situation. Because if we have all these offices in the city, then we have to, if you live outside, you have to commute into the city. But maybe we shall try to rearrange it in a more nuclear way so that we have small places around. So all these people who actually don't live in inner cities, they don't have to commute into the city. They can commute a much shorter way to go to their offices, or maybe even stay at home and work at least part of their work time from their homes. So it's not a question. It's not only a question of how we live or the houses and the buildings. It's also how we organize the economy and how we organize where we have our work offices.
This is of course true, but it makes it sound slightly harder to solve rather than easier in my mind, because then it's again a cultural change issue just as much. Alexander.
Well, I think when you boil it down, it's not so difficult. it's going down to what cities are for, and how do we create this. Places where people can meet and when we have a high quality of life. And then I think if you show, as I just finished a big future study of how the future city would look like in 3 different scenarios. And one of those scenarios are basically a continuation of the car city. And everyone that looks at these images, we have tested on planners and experts and researchers and the public and so on. They say, well, that doesn't look like the future city I would like to live in. So I would say a very core thing here is the idea of the car city that has to somehow have to be deconstructed, and we have to see how we can live and work in cities and solve the transportation in other means. And I would say the basic principle, which you have been touching upon, is the most sustainable way is to live where you work, because otherwise you will create a big transportation problem.
And actually, so what you're saying is that the transformation to a car-free or less car-oriented, car-dependent society, which can happen quite fast, perhaps in something like 10 or 15 years, that could be a fast change that could liberate all kinds of resources for energy, space, and so on, and also a social change space, because people would be changing the way they live and anyway, so to speak, that could have some kind of momentum for maybe this problem to be solvable in our lifetime, so to speak.
Yes, and I think also we see a lot of experiments worldwide. We saw last week Paris made the city center car-free. We had it in Stockholm 2 weeks ago, and in the basically every big city in the United States have these car-free days or open street events and so on. So what we are seeing is experiments of how could we use public spaces and streets and roads in other ways. And when you see the benefit, for example, just a couple of years ago, they took away all cars from Times Square. That's a huge symbolic thing, that in the most magnificent or major metropolis in the world, they take the most significant place and make it car-free. That's very important. And what is happening is that traffic accidents crashes have gone down, and retail's up, and real estate is up, and more people there, and so on. So they can measure the value that is created by transforming the city spaces in this way.
I think we're approaching the end of our time. It's going very, very fast. So I would like to ask the audience whether anyone has a question. Yes, there's a question right there. Please go to the podium and state your name and perhaps your affiliation.
Okay, I am Daniel Diva. I'm a student of environmental engineering here at KTH. And my question is that I'm wondering about the connection between academia, the people that are doing this research, and the people that are in charge of planning for Stockholm as a city. Because if I could take an example of Hagastaden, a new city area that is being developed with 50,000 workplaces and only 60,000 dwellings. And I'm wondering if we are talking about sustainability, if we are talking about sustainable cities, transport is one of the lead drivers of climate change. And I would think that people would design cities where you live as close to where you work as possible. I'm wondering, this seems to be a disconnect. 50,000 workplaces and 6,000 dwellings. What do you think about this?
Thank you very much for this interesting question. And Andrew, we're going to bring it to you as well to hear some international perspectives. But let's start here. Do you, as researchers who clearly understand how this needs to work, get to decide enough or affect enough of what's actually being built? Or at all? Gunnel?
I would really like to have a more discussion with planners and public people. I think we have a problem with that, at least from Stockholm University, where I work. I think it's a bit problematic to get all of our knowledge out to the public. I would really like to have a very vibrant and good public debate in media, which I don't think we have.
Mattias?
I think it's difficult to respond to exactly this question because I haven't studied Hagastaden directly, so I don't know what is behind it or how the distribution is previously exactly there. But in general, I think we have a lot of cooperation, and probably we have more in Stockholm, at KTH with the city of Stockholm. We have the city of Stockholm as one of our strategic partners, and they are partners in the center for which I'm director. They are looking quite a lot into different ways of cooperating.
So it depends on what kinds of aspect of this research we're talking about, essentially. So it seems that maybe some points of view aren't necessarily getting through in the same way.
And you also said this, do we decide enough? And of course, it's not our task to decide. So I think we decide enough. It's good that the politicians take the decisions later on, but we should criticize them when they take the wrong decisions. And that is, of course, an important task for us to show what the consequences are of what they are doing. And as a researcher in future studies, that's, I think, one of our main tasks, showing when politicians take decisions today that will have long-term negative effects that might be even counteracting their own targets, this is something that we should show them. If you do this, you will not reach those targets, and that is something they should be held accountable for. And
urgently should be held accountable for, I think. Alexander?
I think, Mattias, you made a very important point here in the beginning, that what happened when we created the idea of the car city 100 years ago. We can learn from that and see that we could change this system again. And it is important. We have to make a lot of new research on how the cities work and how we can make more affordable, social interactive cities and so on. And then we need education, of course. We need education of students and politicians and the public and so on, and be in the debate. But I also think that this has to end up in politics and legislation, because we have a Carr city legislation system today.
We're running out of time, but Andrew Carr, very briefly, is research playing a role in planning? Does it affect your work as an architect today?
I think certainly as an architect, our sphere of influence tends to be limited just to the particular project and site and client we're working with. In London, the Mayor of London has a London plan, which is informed by lots of people, including researchers. But by the time that's formed, it's often retrospective rather than forward thinking. So things have moved on by the time it actually becomes policy and is implemented.
I think that may in fact describe part of the challenge in moving forward here. Yet we do need to solve these problems. This is all we have time for this evening. Thank you so much, Mattias, Höjer, Gunnel, Forsberg, Alexander Ståhle and Andrew Carr. Crosstalks will be back next month with a new exciting topic. Until then, as always, be safe and be brave.